Some of the oldest medical ideas were wrong. A few were quietly right. And one of the most useful remedies in the ancient world was sitting in a jar that looked ordinary enough to belong in a kitchen. That jar held honey, not honey as most know it today, from a plastic bear on a supermarket shelf, but honey as it was known to the earliest healers, thick, raw, unfiltered, collected from hives that humans had been tending since before the first cities were built. They scraped it from clay vessels and used it on wounds. They watched it work. They did not know why. They only knew that a cut dressed with honey did not turn angry and red, that a burn covered in it healed cleaner than one left to the air. And so the jar sat on the shelf of every healer who understood that some things in the natural world held power they could not explain. The honey jar is a good place to begin because it tells us something about ancient medicine that is easy to forget. Long before anyone understood germs, or infection, or the chemistry of sugar and water, people had already found tools that worked. They found them through observation, through accident, through the slow accumulation of knowledge passed from one pair of hands to the next. The story of ancient medicine is not a story of ignorance waiting to be replaced by science. It is a story of people paying attention to the world around them and trying to make sense of what they saw. The earliest evidence of human concern for health is older than writing. Skeletal remains from the Neolithic period show bones that were broken and healed, set by someone who understood that a limb needed to be held still. Skulls from thousands of years before the Common Era bear marks of trepanation, a hole drilled or scraped into the living bone of the cranium. It is a procedure that sounds brutal to modern ears, and it may have been performed for reasons that ranged from the spiritual to the practical. Some researchers believe it was used to treat head injuries, to relieve pressure on the brain. Others think it may have been intended to release the spirits that were believed to cause illness or madness. What the bones show most clearly is that many of these patients survived. The bone around the hole healed, new tissue grew. Someone lived through the procedure, and that knowledge was not lost. The earliest healers had no written language. They could not record their observations or their methods, but they could show one another. They could watch and imitate and refine. A person who had watched their grandmother set a broken bone, who had felt the way the fragments aligned under their hands, who had seen the leg heal straight and strong. That person carried knowledge that was as real and as useful as anything written in a textbook. The knowledge was not less valuable because it was unwritten. It was simply harder to trace. By the time the first great civilizations emerged along the rivers of Mesopotamia and the Nile, the practice of medicine had become something more than the urgent care of the moment. It had become a discipline, recorded in signs pressed into clay and ink brushed onto papyrus. The oldest surviving medical text in the world comes from the city of Nippur in ancient Sumer, and it dates to around the 22nd century before the Common Era. Written on a clay tablet no larger than a hand, it contains recipes for poultices, washes, and salves made from plants, minerals, and animal products. There are instructions for grinding, mixing, and applying these remedies. There are incantations too, because the line between the physical and the spiritual was not yet drawn. Illness was understood as a disturbance that could come from many directions, from the body, from the environment, from forces that could not be seen. The Mesopotamian diagnostic texts that survive from later periods are remarkable for their thoroughness. The physician would question the patient about their symptoms, examine their body, and observe their behavior. He would note the color of the skin, the quality of the breath, the appearance of the eyes. He would ask about dreams. He would consider the time of year, the phase of the moon, the position of the planets. All of this information would be weighed together to arrive at a diagnosis. The prognosis was often expressed in terms of days. If the patient survives for this many days, they will recover. If not, they will not. These time frames were not arbitrary. They were based on observation. The physicians of Mesopotamia had watched enough patients to know that certain illnesses tended to resolve within a certain number of days, and that patients who did not improve within that window were unlikely to recover. This is the same logic that underlies modern prognostic medicine. The Mesopotamian pharmacopoeia was extensive. The tablets list hundreds of plant-based remedies: the root of the mandrake, the seed of the poppy, the resin of the pine, the gum of the acacia. Minerals too were used: salt, copper, sulfur, and various clays. Some of these substances had genuine therapeutic effects. Others worked, when they worked at all, through the power of association, the belief that a remedy made from a plant that resembled the afflicted body part must somehow be drawn toward it. This idea, known as the doctrine of signatures, would persist in various forms for thousands of years. It is not hard to understand its appeal. In a world where the inner workings of the body were invisible, the visible world offered clues. A plant with a red sap might be good for the blood. A root that forked like a pair of lungs might treat a cough. The reasoning was wrong, but the instinct behind it, the instinct to look for patterns, to connect what was seen with what was not, was the same instinct that would eventually lead to the scientific method. The most famous of the early medical records come from Egypt. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, named for the American collector who acquired it in the 19th century, is a surgical text of remarkable sophistication. It describes 48 cases of injury, arranged from the head downward. Each case follows a deliberate structure: examination, diagnosis, prognosis, and treatment. The physician is instructed to palpate the wound, to observe the patient's expression, to check for mobility and sensation. In the case of a compound fracture of the skull, the papyrus directs the physician to feel for the crepitus, the grating sensation of bone fragments moving against one another. This is a sign that surgeons still use today. The prognosis is given in one of three categories: a condition I will treat, a condition I will contend with, or a condition not to be treated. There is honesty in this classification, a recognition that some injuries were beyond the reach of the healer's skill. It takes a certain kind of humility to say, "This is beyond me." The ancient surgeon had that humility. The Edwin Smith Papyrus was written around the 16th century before the Common Era, but it may preserve knowledge that is centuries older. Some passages appear to describe the meninges of the brain, the folds of tissue that protect the central nervous system. The word the scribe used has been translated as the wrinkled wrapping of the skull. It is not a precise anatomical description, but it is close. There is a description of a blow to the side of the head that causes the patient to lose the ability to speak. The scribe notes that the patient cannot raise his arm on the opposite side of the injury. The surviving record suggests this is a description of aphasia and hemiplegia, symptoms of brain injury that would not be systematically described again for nearly 2,000 years. The Ebers Papyrus, another great Egyptian medical scroll, is a different kind of document. It is larger, looser, more encyclopedic. Where the Edwin Smith Papyrus is the work of a surgeon, the Ebers Papyrus is the work of a collector, a compendium of remedies gathered from many sources. It is a scroll more than 20 meters long, covered in columns of hieratic script. It contains nearly 900 prescriptions for ailments that range from cough to digestive complaints to skin conditions. There are fumigations and inhalations, ointments and poultices, bandages and washes. Many of the ingredients are recognizably botanical: garlic, onion, cumin, coriander, juniper, myrrh, frankincense. Others are less familiar. It is easy to look at these remedies and feel a sense of distance, but the Ebers Papyrus also contains remedies that modern research has found to be genuinely effective. Honey appears repeatedly, so does the moss that the Egyptians used as a dressing, which some studies suggest may have had mild antibiotic properties. The scribes who compiled these remedies did not know about bacteria or infection. They knew only that certain things, when applied in certain ways, helped the body heal, and they preserved that knowledge with care. The Egyptian healer worked in a world where the body was understood as a system of channels. This idea, sometimes called the theory of Metu, held that the body was threaded with passages that carried air, water, blood, and other vital substances. When these channels were blocked, illness followed. Treatment was aimed at clearing the blockage. This might mean purging the digestive tract or encouraging the flow of urine, or drawing blood from a vein. It might also mean reciting a spell, because the blockage could have a spiritual cause, and the words of the healer were part of the cure. This intertwining of the material and the immaterial is one of the hardest things for the modern mind to understand when thinking about ancient medicine. The healer who dressed a wound with honey and the healer who spoke words over the same wound were the same person. Both actions were medicine. Both were necessary. The spell was not a substitute for the honey. It was an addition, a layer of meaning that made the treatment whole. Yet within this blended practice, there was a steady accumulation of practical knowledge. The Egyptians set bones with skill. They used linen bandages that were washed and reused. They built drainage channels for infected wounds. They used splints made of wood and linen, held in place with wraps of woven fabric. They designed small tools for the removal of foreign objects from wounds. These observations did not require germ theory. They required attention, and the ancient healers gave it. The ancient Egyptians also understood the importance of the pulse. They felt it at the wrist, at the temple, at the heart. They associated it with the movement of the channels, with the beat of the heart that pushed vital substances through the body. They did not understand circulation, but they understood that the pulse told them something about the state of the patient. A weak pulse was a bad sign. A strong, regular pulse was a good one. This knowledge was passed from teacher to student, from one generation of healers to the next. In the Indus Valley, medicine followed its own independent trajectory. The Ayurvedic tradition, which took written form in the compendiums of Charaka and Sushruta, is a sophisticated system of medicine that classified diseases, described surgical procedures, and prescribed treatments based on the constitution of the individual patient. Sushruta, who may have lived as early as the 6th century before the Common Era, described surgical procedures including the removal of cataracts, the treatment of hemorrhoids, and the repair of torn earlobes. The surviving record suggests he is also associated with the earliest known description of rhinoplasty, the reconstruction of the nose using a flap of skin from the forehead. This is a procedure that European surgeons would not describe for nearly 2,000 years. The Ayurvedic system was built on the concept of the 3 doshas, which were understood as the fundamental energies that governed the body. Health was a matter of balance among these energies. Illness was the result of imbalance. Treatment included diet, herbs, exercise, meditation, and purification procedures. Many of the herbs used in Ayurvedic medicine have been studied by modern researchers, and historians note that some appear to have genuine pharmacological effects. The tradition of Chinese medicine developed independently as well, with its own framework of ideas. The concept of qi, the vital energy that flows through the body along channels called meridians, is central to Chinese medical theory. Acupuncture, the insertion of fine needles at specific points along these meridians, was developed as a way to regulate the flow of qi and restore health. The earliest known medical text in China, the Inner Canon of the Yellow Emperor, was compiled over several centuries beginning around the 3rd century before the Common Era. It is a dialogue between the legendary Yellow Emperor and his physician, and it covers anatomy, physiology, pathology, diagnosis, and treatment. Chinese physicians also developed a sophisticated pharmacopoeia. The classic of herbal medicine lists 365 medicinal substances, one for each day of the year. The text describes the properties of each substance, the conditions it treats, and the methods of preparation. It is the product of centuries of observation. On the island of Kos, in the eastern Aegean, a physician named Hippocrates gathered a school of followers around him in the late 5th century before the Common Era. The works attributed to the Hippocratic corpus are not a single coherent system. They are a collection of texts written over several decades by several authors with differing views, but they share a common approach: the belief that disease has natural causes, that it can be observed and described, and that the physician's task is to support the body in its own effort to heal. This was not a revolutionary departure from earlier medicine, though it is often portrayed as one. Egyptian and Mesopotamian healers had already recognized that many illnesses followed predictable patterns. What the Hippocratic writers did was give this approach a philosophical framework. They articulated it clearly. They insisted on it. One of the most significant texts in the Hippocratic corpus is the Epidemics, a collection of case histories describing illnesses that occurred in various cities and the outcomes for individual patients. The physician describes the weather, the season, the prevailing conditions. He describes the patient's symptoms day by day. He records whether the patient lived or died. These are not theoretical treatises, they are clinical records, as direct as anything a modern doctor might write in a chart. A case from the Epidemics: a woman in Thasos, after giving birth, developed a fever. On the third day, she had a rigor. She complained of pain in the chest. Her urine was thin and colorless. On the sixth day, she became delirious. On the seventh day, her fever rose. On the eighth day, she died. The physician recorded all of this without comment, without judgment. The next physician who encountered a similar case would have this record to consult. The framework the Hippocratic writers used was the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health depended on the balance of these four fluids within the body. Illness was the result of imbalance. Treatment was aimed at restoring balance through diet, exercise, purging, bloodletting, or the administration of substances thought to correct the excess of one humor or another. Each humor was associated with a pair of qualities. Blood was hot and moist. Phlegm was cold and moist. Yellow bile was hot and dry. Black bile was cold and dry. The balance of these qualities within the individual was believed to determine their temperament and their susceptibility to disease. A person who was predominantly phlegmatic was thought to be calm and slow-moving, but prone to respiratory ailments. A person who was predominantly choleric was thought to be quick-tempered and energetic, but prone to fevers and inflammations. These associations are not supported by modern science, but they represent an early attempt to understand the connection between constitution and health. The theory of the four humors was wrong. There is no black bile, there is no yellow bile in the sense they meant, but the theory was useful because it gave physicians a way to think about the body that was systematic and predictive. It organized observation, it encouraged the keeping of records, it made medicine a subject that could be taught and debated. The Hippocratic physician was expected to observe the patient carefully, to note the color of the skin, the temperature of the limbs, the character of the pulse, the appearance of the urine and stool. These observations were recorded, along with the course of the illness and the outcome. Case histories were written down so that others could learn from them. This practice, the systematic observation and recording of illness, did not cure anyone directly, but it laid the groundwork for all clinical medicine that followed. The Hippocratic Oath, though probably not written by Hippocrates himself, reflects the values of the school. It binds the physician to a standard of conduct, to do no harm, to respect the privacy of the patient, to teach the art to those who are worthy of it. The oath has been modified many times over the centuries, but its core principles remain recognizable. They are the ethical foundation on which the profession of medicine still rests. The Hippocratic physician also understood the importance of prognosis. In a world without diagnostic tests, the physician who could predict the course of an illness earned the trust of his patients. The physician who mastered this art could tell a patient whether they would recover and how long it would take. He could also recognize when a case was hopeless and spare the patient the expense and discomfort of useless treatments. In Greece, there were also temples dedicated to Asclepius, the god of healing. These were places of incubation where the sick would come to sleep in the sacred precinct and receive healing dreams. The temples were often located in places with natural springs, clean air, and quiet surroundings. There is a sense in which these were the first dedicated healing spaces where the sick could rest and receive care. The priests of Asclepius understood something important about healing: that rest, quiet, and a sense of being cared for could make a real difference. In the great library of Alexandria, scholars studied anatomy through the dissection of animal and, for a brief period, human bodies in the early 3rd century before the Common Era. Herophilus of Chalcedon distinguished between the nerves and the tendons, identified the brain as the seat of intelligence, and described the structure of the eye. He traced the nerves from the brain to the spinal cord, mapping the pathways that carry sensation and movement. He described the ventricles of the brain, the cavities that are filled with cerebrospinal fluid. He studied the liver, the pancreas, the reproductive organs. Erasistratus, his contemporary, studied the heart and the blood vessels. He described the valves of the heart, the thin flaps of tissue that open and close to direct the flow of blood. He understood that the heart was a pump, though the surviving record suggests he did not fully understand where the blood went. He distinguished between the cerebrum and the cerebellum, recognizing that different parts of the brain served different functions. These Alexandrian physicians were not practicing medicine in the way we would recognize. Their work was theoretical, anatomical, investigative, but their willingness to open the body and look inside represented a profound shift. For centuries, the interior of the human body had been a mystery. They began to map it. The knowledge they gained was not immediately useful for treating patients, but it was foundational. It was the beginning of anatomy as a science. In Rome, medicine took a more practical turn. The Roman Empire was an engine of engineering and organization. Celsus, a scholar of the 1st century of the Common Era, compiled an encyclopedia of medicine that described surgical procedures, wound treatment, and the management of fractures with remarkable clarity. His description of the signs of inflammation, redness, swelling, heat, pain is so precise that it is still taught to medical students today. But the great figure of Roman medicine was Galen of Pergamon, a physician who worked in the 2nd century of the Common Era and whose authority would dominate Western medicine for nearly 1,500 years. Galen was trained in the Greek tradition, and he accepted the theory of the 4 humors. But he was also a skilled anatomist and an indefatigable writer. He dissected animals, monkeys, pigs, goats, and applied what he found to the human body, sometimes correctly and sometimes not. He performed experiments, tying off arteries and observing the effects. He treated gladiators in his hometown of Pergamon, giving him direct experience of wounds, fractures, and trauma. Galen was limited by the fact that Roman law prohibited the dissection of human bodies. He worked with animals, particularly the Barbary macaque, and assumed that its anatomy was similar to that of humans. In many ways it was, in some important ways it was not. His descriptions of the human uterus, for example, were based on the dissections of dogs, leading to errors that would persist for centuries. Galen was an extraordinary experimentalist. He demonstrated the function of the recurrent laryngeal nerve by cutting it in a living pig and showing that the animal could no longer squeal. He showed that the arteries contained blood, not air, by tying off an artery and opening it above the ligature. He understood that the kidneys filtered the blood to produce urine. He described the function of the spinal cord by making cuts at different levels and observing the resulting paralysis. These experiments were carried out without anesthesia on animals that were restrained but conscious. They were brutal by modern standards. They were also brilliant. Galen's system was comprehensive and internally consistent. It explained everything, and that was both its strength and its weakness. Because Galen was so prolific, so authoritative, and so well argued, later physicians tended to accept his teachings without question. For centuries, medical education was largely the study of Galen. If a physician in the 14th century encountered a symptom that did not match Galen's description, the physician was more likely to doubt his own observation than to doubt Galen. This is not a criticism of Galen. He did what all great medical thinkers do. He synthesized the knowledge of his time, added his own observations, and created a framework that made sense of the art of healing. That his framework would eventually become a barrier to progress was not his fault. It was the fault of those who came after him and forgot that medicine must always be tested against experience. In the long arc of human healing, there is a stretch of story that belongs neither to the banks of the Nile nor to the rocky shores of the Aegean, but to the vast spaces between. It is a quieter thread woven on the Indian subcontinent and across the high plains of China, where medicine grew not from the knife or the incantation alone, but from close watching of the body, of the seasons, of the pulse beneath the fingers, and of the plants that rose from the earth year after year. These traditions did not erupt suddenly. They accumulated slowly across centuries, carried by teachers and students, by handwritten manuscripts, and by the steady practice of noticing what worked and what did not. In ancient India, the practice of medicine was inseparable from a larger view of life. Health was not merely the absence of pain, but a kind of balance, a steady state between forces that moved within the body and forces that pressed in from the world outside. The three humors, or doshas, were the language used to describe this balance. They were not substances you could grasp in your hand, but patterns, wind and movement, fire and transformation, water and structure. Each person carried a unique mixture of these forces, and illness arose when something pushed them out of their natural proportion. The task of the physician was to read the disturbance and gently guide the body back toward its own equilibrium. This was not a system based on guesswork. It was built on careful observation, refined over many generations, and written down in texts that would travel far beyond the land of their origin. The Charaka Samhita and the Sushruta Samhita are the great surviving works of this tradition, and they are remarkable not for their age alone, but for the quality of attention they reveal. They describe the body in layers: skin and muscle and bone, channels and organs, the subtle pathways through which breath and nourishment travel. They list hundreds of plants and minerals, noting the taste of each, the way it behaves after digestion, the conditions under which it might calm or stimulate. They are not recipe books. They are records of a long conversation between healers and the natural world, written down so that the conversation might continue. The plants themselves were central. In the forests and along the riverbanks of the subcontinent, a vast pharmacy grew wild and cultivated. Turmeric for its warmth, neem for its bitterness, ashwagandha for its quiet strength. Healers did not reach for these remedies at random. They watched how a plant grew, in shade or sun, in dry soil or wet, and understood that its character might mirror something in the patient. A cooling plant for a fevered body, a drying plant for one that held too much moisture. The reasoning was not symbolic. It was empirical, drawn from centuries of trial and the slow accumulation of reliable knowledge. The healer's approach to a patient was unhurried. The pulse was read not as a single beat, but as a story, felt at the wrist with 3 fingers, each one listening for a different depth. The tongue, the eyes, the quality of the voice, all of these were read as signs. The patient was asked about sleep, about digestion, about the weather of their daily life. The diagnosis was not a name, but a description of what had fallen out of balance, and the treatment was not a command, but a suggestion. This food, this rhythm, this preparation of leaves or roots taken over time. There were places set aside for healing. In the great cities of the ancient Indian world, travelers and the sick could find rest in institutions that resembled hospitals, though the word does not quite capture them. These were shelters where a person could lie down, receive care, and be watched over by those who understood the properties of herbs and the rhythms of the body. The idea that the sick deserved a quiet place to recover, separate from the noise of the market and the demands of daily life, was understood long before it became common elsewhere. Knowledge moved through families and through schools. A healer trained beside a teacher for years, learning not only which plant to use for which condition, but how to observe, how to listen, how to touch the wrist with the right pressure. The texts were memorized, recited, passed from one generation to the next. Students came from distant regions to study at famous centers of learning, where medicine was taught alongside astronomy, philosophy, and the careful study of language. The written word preserved what might otherwise have been lost. But the living transmission, the teacher watching the student, correcting the hand, refining the eye, was the true vessel. To the east, Across the great mountain ranges and the high plateaus, another tradition was unfolding, rooted in the same fundamental questions but shaped by a different landscape and a different sensibility. In ancient China, medicine grew from the same soil as philosophy. The body was understood as a small country, governed by the same principles that governed the seasons, the rivers, and the stars. Health was harmony, illness was a break in the pattern. The great text that carries this vision is the Huangdi Neijing, the inner canon of the Yellow Emperor, a work compiled over many centuries, gathering the insights of generations into a single, layered conversation. It is not a book one person wrote. It is a record of a tradition thinking aloud. In its pages, the body is mapped not by anatomy alone, but by energy and function. The organs are not simply pumps and filters. They are officials, each with a role, each connected to the others through pathways invisible to the eye. The heart is the ruler, the lungs are the ministers, the liver is the general. The language is poetic, but the underlying vision is practical. The body works as a whole, and when one part falters, the entire system responds. The concept of qi is central to this view. It is not easy to translate. It is breath, energy, the vital current that moves through every living thing. When qi flows freely, the body is warm, resilient, and at ease. When it stalls or turns, discomfort follows. The physician's task is to sense the movement of qi, again at the pulse, again with careful attention, and to restore its proper course. The pulse in Chinese medicine is read with even greater subtlety than in the Indian tradition. The wrist is felt at multiple positions and depths, and each variation tells a story about a different organ, a different layer of the body's interior landscape. Balance is described through the interplay of yin and yang, two forces that are not opposites in conflict, but partners in a continuous dance. Yin is cool, still, inward, the substance of the body. Yang is warm, active, outward, the function of the body. Neither is better than the other. Health is the rhythm between them, the way day follows night and exhale follows inhale. When yin and yang are in balance, a person does not notice their own body. When they fall out of balance, the body speaks and the physician listens. Plants were used here too, but in a different key. The Chinese materia medica is vast, organized by taste, by thermal nature, by the channel each herb enters. Ginger warms the middle. Peppermint cools the surface. Ginseng strengthens the deep reserves. As in India, the healer did not reach for a plant because a book said so, but because generations of use had shown that this root, prepared this way, taken at this time, moved the body in a reliable direction. The knowledge was empirical, tested not in laboratories, but in the quiet rooms where sick people lay waiting to be helped. Healing spaces in ancient China took many forms. There were clinics attached to temples, where monks versed in medicine offered care alongside prayer. There were physicians who traveled from village to village, carrying their herbs in cloth bundles, stopping where they were needed. And there were the great imperial hospitals, established by rulers who understood that a healthy population was a stable one. These institutions were not common, but their existence shows that the care of the sick was understood as a public good, not merely a private concern. Knowledge moved across generations through apprenticeship, through family lines, and through the careful copying of texts. A physician in training would memorize the classics, learn the pulse, spend years watching his teacher treat patients before he was trusted to treat his own. The great medical texts were annotated by generation after generation of readers, each one adding a margin note, a clarification, a question. The tradition grew not by replacing old knowledge, but by layering new understanding on top of it. Both of these traditions, Indian and Chinese, share something quiet and powerful. They are not dramatic. They do not feature the brilliant surgeon working alone or the miraculous cure that saves a city. They are traditions of patience, of observation, of the slow accumulation of reliable knowledge. They understood that the body is not a machine to be repaired, but a living system to be supported. They understood that healing takes time, that the right plant, or the right rest, or the right rhythm of life can slowly bring a person back to themselves. Between the great civilizations of Egypt and Greece, these traditions flourished, mostly out of sight of the Western story. They were not disconnected from one another. Trade routes carried plants, ideas, and sometimes whole texts across deserts and mountains, but they developed their own languages, their own logic, their own ways of touching the sick. They remind us that the history of medicine is not a single line running from the past to the present, but a web woven from many threads, each one the work of people who were paying close attention. So as you lie here, letting the weight of the day settle, consider the long, quiet labor of those early physicians. They had no machines, no microscopes, no way to see inside the living body except through the evidence of the senses and the steady work of reason. They touched the wrist and felt the story of a life. They watched the tongue and read the weather of the body. They walked into the forest, gathered a root, and trusted what generations before them had learned. Their medicine was slow, humble, and deeply human. And in that slowness, there is something restful to carry with you into sleep. During the Roman period, Dioscorides, a Greek physician who traveled with the Roman army, compiled his Materia Medica, a comprehensive description of more than 600 medicinal plants and their uses. Dioscorides traveled widely, collecting plants and learning from the people who used them. His descriptions are precise and practical: the appearance of the plant, where it grows, when it should be harvested, how it should be prepared, what conditions it treats. The Materia Medica would remain a standard reference for 1600 years. The pharmacy of the ancient world was rooted in the plant kingdom. Around every healer's workspace, there were clay jars and wooden boxes filled with dried leaves, ground roots, seeds, resins, and powders. The shelves of the early apothecary held sage for sore throats, chamomile for upset stomachs, fennel for digestion, mint for nausea, and willow bark for pain. The knowledge of which plants relieved which conditions spread along trade routes, passed from one culture to the next. A remedy used in the hills of Anatolia might appear in the markets of Alexandria, then in the shops of Rome, then in the gardens of a monastery in Gaul. This was the great unwritten curriculum of ancient medicine. The healers who gathered plants from riverbanks and hillsides, who dried them in the shade and stored them in cloth bags, who watched which preparations worked and which did not. These were the true pharmacologists of the ancient world. They had no laboratories, they had their senses. They tasted the bitterness of a root and knew it was strong medicine. They smelled the sharpness of a resin and knew it would clear the head. They watched a wound that was packed with certain molds heal without festering, and they filed that observation away for the next time. The Romans also made important contributions to public health and hygiene. They built aqueducts to bring clean water to their cities. The aqueducts of Rome carried millions of gallons of water each day from mountain springs into the heart of the city, supplying public fountains, bathhouses, and latrines. They constructed sewers to carry waste away. The Cloaca Maxima, the great sewer of Rome, was built in the 6th century before the Common Era and remained in use for more than 2,000 years. They understood that swamps and marshes were associated with fever, though they attributed this to bad air, the miasma theory of disease. They drained wetlands. They built public baths where citizens could wash, exercise, and socialize. These measures were not understood as medical interventions at the time, but they had a greater impact on health than any physician's treatment. Roman military medicine was also highly organized. Each legion had its own physicians, its own hospital tents, its own system for evacuating the wounded. The Roman army understood that a soldier who knew he would be cared for if wounded fought more bravely. This was practical psychology as much as medicine, but it also meant that Roman military physicians had extensive experience with trauma and wound care. In the Eastern Mediterranean, the Roman Empire did not fall in the 5th century. It continued for another 1,000 years as Byzantium, centered on Constantinople. In the monasteries and libraries of the Byzantine world, the medical texts of the ancient Greeks were preserved, copied, and studied. Physicians like Oribaisis compiled vast encyclopedias of medical knowledge, drawing on the works of Galen, Hippocrates, and others. He collected everything he could find and organized it into a coherent medical encyclopedia. It kept the knowledge alive. Aetius of Amida, writing in the 6th century, compiled a medical encyclopedia that preserved the works of earlier physicians, many of which would otherwise have been lost. Paul of Aegina, writing in the 7th century, produced a medical compendium that included a detailed section on surgery, describing procedures that would not be improved upon for centuries. Without the Byzantine copyists, many of the Greek medical texts that later reached Europe would have been lost. The great medical manuscripts that survive from this period are tangible evidence of the care with which this knowledge was transmitted. The parchment is thick and warm. The ink is the color of aged sepia. The letters are formed with deliberate precision. Each page was made by hand, each word copied from a text that was itself a copy, stretching back in an unbroken chain to the ancient world. In the Islamic world, medicine reached a height that rivaled and in some ways surpassed the achievements of Greece and Rome. Beginning in the 7th century of the Common Era, the Abbasid caliphs of Baghdad sponsored the translation of Greek medical texts into Arabic. The Great Translation movement of the 8th and 9th centuries brought the works of Hippocrates, Galen, Dioscorides, and others into the libraries of the Islamic world. The translators worked in the House of Wisdom, the Great Library and Translation Center of Baghdad. But Islamic physicians did more than preserve. They advanced. Al-Razi, known in the West as Rhazes, was a Persian physician of the 9th and 10th centuries who wrote extensively on medicine, alchemy, and philosophy. He was the director of the hospital in Baghdad, and the surviving record includes a story that he chose the site for a new hospital by hanging pieces of meat around the city and observing where they spoiled slowest, reasoning that the cleanest air would be the best for healing. Whether the story is true or not, it reflects something important about his approach. He believed in observation, experience, and evidence. He did not trust authority without verification. Al-Razi wrote a comprehensive medical encyclopedia that drew on Greek sources but added his own clinical observations. It covers every aspect of medicine known at the time. He did not simply repeat what earlier physicians had written. He added his own case histories, his own observations, his own judgments about what worked and what did not. He is also known for his treatise on smallpox and measles, in which he distinguished between the two diseases for the first time. He described their symptoms, their progression, and their outcomes with a clarity that would not be surpassed for centuries. The surviving record suggests he noted that survivors of smallpox rarely contracted the disease again, an early observation of acquired immunity. Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, was a physician and philosopher of the early 11th century. His Canon of Medicine was one of the most influential medical texts ever written. It organized medical knowledge into a logical and comprehensive system, covering anatomy, physiology, pathology, pharmacology, and therapeutics. It was studied in Europe as well as the Islamic world, and the surviving record suggests it remained a standard textbook for 500 years. The canon begins with a definition of medicine that is calm and measured. It is the science by which we learn the states of the human body in health and in the absence of health, in order to preserve health when it exists and restore it when it is lost. It assumes that medicine is a science, that its principles can be known and taught. It does not appeal to magic or divine intervention. The canon is divided into 5 books. The first covers general principles. The second covers simple drugs, arranged alphabetically. The third covers diseases of the individual organs, from head to toe. The fourth covers diseases that affect the whole body, such as fevers and epidemics. The fifth covers compound drugs and prescriptions. Ibn Sina insisted that medicine must be based on logic, that the physician must understand the causes of disease, not merely the symptoms. He distinguished between diseases caused by external factors and diseases that arose from internal imbalances. He recognized that the mind and the body were connected, that emotional states could affect physical health. Al-Zaharwi, known in the West as Abul Qasis, was a surgeon of the 10th and 11th centuries who practiced in Córdoba in Islamic Spain. His medical encyclopedia includes a detailed section on surgery describing instruments, procedures, and techniques. He illustrated his surgical instruments with drawings, making it possible for other surgeons to understand and reproduce his methods. Historians note he described the use of catgut for internal sutures, a material that would be used for the same purpose 1,000 years later. He described procedures for removing cataracts, treating fractures, and stopping hemorrhages. Al-Zaharwi understood something important about surgery, that it required not only knowledge but also skill. He wrote about the importance of practice, of learning to use instruments before operating on a patient. He warned against haste, against carelessness, against pride. A good surgeon, he wrote, must be steady of hand and calm of mind. The Islamic world also developed the institution of the hospital as a center of medical care and teaching. The hospitals of Baghdad, Cairo, and Damascus were not merely places where the sick were taken. They were teaching hospitals, with libraries and lecture halls, where physicians trained new physicians. The Great Hospital of Cairo, founded in the 13th century by the Mamluk Sultan Qalawun, had separate wards for different conditions, a pharmacy, a library, and a staff that included physicians, surgeons, and oculists. It treated all who came, regardless of their ability to pay. It was open day and night. This was a significant development in the history of medicine. The hospital as an institution, a dedicated space for healing, organized around the care of the sick, was not entirely new. There had been temples of healing in Greece and Egypt. There had been military hospitals in Rome. There had been infirmaries and monasteries, but the Islamic hospital was different. It was a place of professional medical practice, where the knowledge of the physician was applied to the care of the patient in a systematic way. It was a place where physicians could consult with one another, share their observations, and learn from their mistakes. The pharmacy became a specialized institution during this period. The early apothecaries of the Islamic world prepared and dispensed medicines under regulation. The druggist was expected to know the properties of hundreds of plant, mineral, and animal substances, and to prepare them according to established formulas. The pharmacopoeia of this period was vast and sophisticated. It included syrups and confections, powders and pills, ointments and oils. Many of the preparations required careful technique: distillation, maceration, filtration, crystallization. The Islamic pharmacists were chemists as well as dispensers, and they developed many of the techniques that would later become standard in pharmaceutical chemistry. The physician Ibn al-Nafis, writing in the 13th century, made a discovery that contradicted Galen on a fundamental point. Galen had taught that the blood passed through invisible pores in the septum of the heart, moving from the right ventricle to the left. Ibn al-Nafis, studying the anatomy of the heart, concluded that this was impossible. The septum was solid. The blood must pass through the lungs instead. He described the pulmonary circulation more than 300 years before this discovery would be made in Europe. His work was not widely known in the West, and the discovery had to be made again. In the cloisters and scriptoria of medieval Europe, medicine took a different path. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the organized medical institutions of Rome were largely lost. What remained was the knowledge preserved in monasteries, where monks copied and studied the medical texts they had inherited. The monastic infirmary became the primary site of medical care in early medieval Europe. The medicine of the monastery was modest, practical, and deeply connected to the cultivation of plants. The monastic garden was a pharmacy. The monks grew sage and rosemary, fennel and dill, mint and chamomile, feverfew and betony. They dried and stored these herbs, made infusions and decoctions, prepared ointments and compresses. They treated their fellow monks and the people of the surrounding countryside with what they had. The monastic infirmarian was not a trained physician. He was a monk who had learned the properties of plants, who knew how to set a bone and dress a wound, who understood the value of rest and good food for a patient recovering from illness. The monastic practice of bloodletting deserves particular mention. It was performed regularly, not as a treatment for specific diseases, but as a preventive measure, a way of maintaining the balance of the humors. The monks would gather in the infirmary, and the infirmarian would open a vein in the arm of each monk in turn. The blood was collected in a bowl, and the amount was carefully measured. Afterward, the monks would rest for a day or two, eating specially prepared food and drinking herbal infusions. The practice seems strange to modern eyes, but it was done with care, with attention to the well-being of the patient. This tradition of botanical medicine was not unique to the monasteries. People had gathered wild plants for healing since before recorded history. Every village had its wise woman or cunning man who knew which plants to gather and when. They knew that willow bark could ease a fever. They knew that yarrow could stop bleeding. They knew that chamomile could calm an upset stomach. This knowledge was passed down through generations. It was not written down, but it was preserved with remarkable fidelity. The monasteries systematized this knowledge. They wrote it down. The herbals of the medieval period, manuscripts describing the appearance, properties, and uses of medicinal plants, represent the earliest European attempts to create a reference for botanical medicine. They mix accurate observation with folklore and superstition. The mandrake root, for example, was said to shriek when pulled from the ground, and the collector was advised to stop his ears against the sound. But beneath these fanciful claims there is real knowledge. The monks who copied these herbals knew which plants were useful and which were dangerous. They knew how to prepare them. They knew when to harvest them. One of the most famous of these manuscripts is the Vienna Dioscorides, a copy of the 1st century Greek herbal by Dioscorides, made in Constantinople in the early 6th century. The illustrations are exquisite. Each plant is painted with care and attention, the leaves and flowers rendered in naturalistic detail. The manuscript was used, studied, and eventually brought to the West. It is a bridge between the ancient world and the medieval, between the Mediterranean of the Roman Empire and the libraries of Europe. The medieval period also saw the emergence of the university, and with it, the formal study of medicine as an academic discipline. The medical school at Salerno, in southern Italy, was active from the 9th century and became one of the most important centers of medical learning in Europe. It drew on Greek, Roman, and Arabic sources. The school at Montpellier followed. Bologna, Paris, Padua, each developed its own tradition of medical teaching. The curriculum was based on the works of Galen, Hippocrates, and Avicenna. At these universities, medicine was studied as a textual discipline. The student read the works of Galen, Hippocrates, and Avicenna. He attended lectures in which these texts were explained and discussed. He debated questions of theory and practice. Dissection was rare, and clinical experience was limited. The medieval physician was a scholar who knew the books, but the books were not enough. By the late medieval period, there was a growing sense that the inherited medical knowledge of the ancients was incomplete. The Black Death, which swept through Europe in the middle of the 14th century, killed perhaps a third of the population. The physicians of the time had no explanation and no effective treatment. They could not stop it. The plague shook the confidence that had been placed in the authority of the ancients. The plague came in waves. It arrived in Sicily in 1347, carried by rats on ships from the Black Sea. It spread northward through Italy, France, Germany, and England, reaching Scandinavia within 2 years. The symptoms were terrible: swollen lymph nodes, dark patches on the skin, fever, vomiting, and death within days. The physicians tried everything they knew. They bled their patients, they applied poultices, they prescribed drugs. Nothing worked. Some physicians fled. Some stayed and died alongside their patients. People began to question whether the traditional authorities really understood disease. The foundations of medical authority had been weakened, though it would take another century for the cracks to become visible. In the 15th and 16th centuries, a new spirit of inquiry began to emerge. Physicians started to question Galen openly. They performed their own dissections, and they saw things that did not match his descriptions. Andreas Vesalius, a Flemish anatomist working in Padua, published his great work on the fabric of the human body in 1543. The book was based on direct observation. Vesalius had dissected the bodies of executed criminals himself, and he had drawn what he saw. His illustrations showed the human body not as Galen had described it, but as it actually was. The book is a masterpiece of both science and art. Vesalius was careful not to attack Galen directly. He knew that Galen's authority was immense, but the evidence of his own eyes forced him to correct Galen on point after point. The human jawbone was a single bone, not two, as Galen had claimed. The sternum was 3 segments, not 7. The veins did not originate in the liver. These were small corrections, but they were significant. They demonstrated that the ancient authorities could be wrong, and that direct observation could reveal the truth. Vesalius had to overcome significant obstacles. Human cadavers were difficult to obtain. The authorities were suspicious of anatomists, who were sometimes accused of grave robbery. Vesalius dissected in secret, by candlelight, working quickly before the body began to decompose. He did the dissections himself. He wanted to see for himself. The 16th century also saw the work of Paracelsus, a physician and alchemist who rejected the entire framework of ancient medicine. Paracelsus burned the books of Galen and Avicenna in public, and he insisted that the physician must learn from nature, not from texts. He was a difficult, combative figure, and his own ideas were often as strange as those he rejected, but he pushed the boundaries of medical thinking. He introduced chemical remedies into European medicine, preparations of mercury, sulfur, and antimony, and he argued that disease was not a matter of humoral imbalance, but of specific external causes. Paracelsus traveled widely, learning from barbers, midwives, and folk healers. He believed that the wisdom of ordinary people was as valuable as the learning of the universities. Historians note he was one of the first to recognize that occupational diseases, the illnesses of miners, for example, were caused by environmental factors. He was wrong about many things, but he was right about one essential point. The old authorities could not be trusted without question. The idea that disease might have specific causes, as opposed to a general imbalance of bodily fluids, was a profound shift. It pointed toward a future in which diseases could be classified, studied, and treated individually. It also pointed toward the possibility of prevention. The work of Paracelsus was erratic and controversial, but it helped to loosen the grip of ancient authority and open medicine to new ideas. The 17th century brought the microscope. The first simple microscopes were made by Dutch lens grinders in the late 16th century, but it was Antony van Leeuwen in the 1670s who perfected the instrument and used it to observe a world that no one had ever seen. He examined a drop of pond water and saw tiny organisms swimming and darting. He scraped the plaque from his own teeth and saw bacteria. He described these little animals, as he called them, with wonder and precision. He examined the blood, the muscle fibers, the crystalline lens of the eye. He saw the striations of muscle tissue. He drew what he saw with painstaking accuracy. Leeuwenhoek did not connect his little animals to disease. The idea that microorganisms could cause illness would not emerge for another 2 centuries, but his observations opened a door. They revealed that the human body was not alone. It was home to countless invisible inhabitants, some of which might be friends and some of which might be enemies. The world beneath the lens was crowded and active, a civilization of tiny creatures living their lives in a drop of water, on the surface of a tooth, in the dark recesses of the human gut. The scientific revolution of the 17th and 18th centuries transformed medicine in other ways as well. William Harvey, in 1628, published his discovery of the circulation of blood. He demonstrated that the heart pumped blood through the arteries, and that it returned through the veins, completing a circuit. Ibn al-Nafis had described the pulmonary circulation centuries earlier, but Harvey proved the full system. He measured the volume of blood ejected by the heart and showed that the body could not possibly produce that much blood from scratch. It had to be the same blood, moving in a loop. Harvey conducted his experiments with careful attention to measurement. He calculated the capacity of the heart, the amount of blood ejected with each beat, the number of beats per minute, the total volume of blood in the body. The numbers did not add up unless the blood was recirculating. This was mathematics as much as biology, and it was a new way of thinking about the body as a system that could be measured and quantified. Harvey's discovery dealt a heavy blow to Galenic medicine. If the blood circulated, then many of Galen's ideas about the movement of fluids in the body were simply wrong. The theory of the four humors had already been weakened. Harvey's discovery made it impossible to sustain in its original form. The microscope continued to reveal more. In the 18th century, Giovanni Battista Morgagni, an Italian anatomist, correlated the symptoms his patients had experienced during life with the changes he found in their organs after death. He showed that disease was not a general state of the whole body, but a local process that affected specific tissues. A cough and fever were not merely a humoral imbalance. They were likely to be accompanied by a visible change in the lungs. He described the hardening of the arteries, the scarring of the heart valves, the tumors and abscesses and inflammations that could be seen with the naked eye. He published his findings in 1761 in a work titled On the Seats and Causes of Disease. Morgani's work laid the foundation for pathological anatomy, the study of disease as a physical change in the structure of the body. Medicine was becoming a science grounded in observable evidence. Through all of these transformations, the old knowledge was not entirely discarded. The herbs that the monks had grown in their gardens were still used. The honey that the Egyptians had applied to wounds was still applied. The splints and bandages of the ancient surgeons were still part of the physician's repertoire. What changed was the framework within which this knowledge was understood. The ancient healers had worked within a world of visible surfaces and invisible forces. They had no way to see inside the body. They had no way to measure the chemistry of the blood or the electrical activity of the nerves. They worked with what they had: their eyes, their hands, their memory of what had worked before, their sense of the patterns that governed health and illness. The modern physician works within a world of deep visibility. The interior of the body can be seen, measured, monitored, imaged. The causes of disease can be traced to molecules and genes. The tools of diagnosis and treatment are powerful beyond anything the ancient healers could have imagined. And yet the honey jar remains. It sits on the shelf in the pharmacy of the mind, a reminder that some of the oldest remedies in the world were not merely superstitions waiting to be discarded. They were observations tested by generations of use, preserved in clay and parchment and papyrus and memory. Modern research has confirmed that honey does have antibacterial properties. It works by drawing water from bacterial cells, by producing hydrogen peroxide through the action of an enzyme called glucose oxidase, and by creating an acidic environment that discourages microbial growth. The ancient healers did not know these mechanisms, but they saw that the honey worked, and they used it, and they were right. The story of ancient medicine is the story of that seeing and remembering. It is the story of the first person to notice that a particular leaf, when pressed against a cut, seemed to stop the bleeding. The story of the first person to realize that certain plants, when steeped in hot water, could settle an upset stomach. The story of the first person to observe that a fever often broke on the seventh day, and to wonder whether there was a pattern in it, and then to watch and wait and record what they saw. These were not discoveries in the modern sense. They were not the result of controlled experiments or statistical analysis. They were the result of attention, of the human mind doing what it does best, noticing patterns, making connections, passing on what was learned. The great civilizations of the ancient world, Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, China, Greece, Rome, Byzantium, the Islamic world, the kingdoms of medieval Europe, each contributed to this accumulation of knowledge. Each added its own observations, its own frameworks, its own attempts to make sense of the mystery of health and illness. The Egyptian physician examined the pulse and felt for the channels of the body. The Greek physician watched the course of a fever and classified the days. The Islamic physician built the hospital and organized the pharmacy. The medieval herb gatherer walked the fields and woods, collecting the plants that would fill the shelves of the monastic infirmary. They were all part of the same slow, patient work. They were all trying to understand the body, to protect it, to restore it when it faltered. And when we look back at them from the vantage of the present, it is tempting to see only what they did not know. They did not know about germs. They did not know about the circulation of blood. They did not know about the chemistry of digestion or the electrical impulses that flash along the nerves. They did not know about DNA or the immune system or the countless microorganisms that live on and in the human body. But they knew about honey. They knew about willow bark. They knew about the value of rest, the importance of clean water, the danger of wounds that turned bad. They knew that the body had an ability to heal itself, and that the physician's task was to support that ability, not to override it. They knew that the mind affected the body, that hope and fear and calm and anxiety could influence the course of an illness. They knew that a patient who trusted their healer was more likely to recover. These were not trivial observations. They were the foundation on which everything else was built. The oldest jar in the cabinet of medicine is still the one that holds honey. It has been there for longer than anyone remembers. It was there before the first city walls rose, before the first letters were pressed into clay, before the first physician wrote down the first case history. It will probably be there long after the last of us is gone. Medicine has changed. It has become something that the ancient healers would not recognize. The instruments are finer, the knowledge deeper, the treatments more effective. The mystery of the body has been gradually illuminated, layer by layer, like the pages of a book being turned in the quiet of a library. And yet, at the center of it all, there remains the same impulse that drove the first healer to press a honey-soaked cloth against a wound. The desire to help, to ease suffering, to restore what is broken. The honey jar sits quietly on the shelf, a small and ordinary object, holding within it the whole story of the long human effort to find what works, to preserve it, and to pass it on. The lamp flickers low, the shelves recede into shadow. The remedies remain, waiting in their jars and on their pages for whoever might need them next. Close your eyes, breathe slowly, let the body do what it has always known how to do, and sleep.